Sometimes life strips away everything you thought you knew about yourself. When Elias Munro buried his wife, he thought he'd lost it all: his heart, his hope, his reason to keep going. Now he's inherited something nobody wants, a dark cave in the mountains. His father spent years digging there, chasing conspiracy theories and old stories. Everyone calls him crazy for even looking at it. But deep in that cave sits a vault from the Civil War worth $123 million. What happens when a desperate father discovers that sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't money, but the strength to fight for what matters most? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun filtered through the thin curtains of the Munro kitchen, casting pale rectangles across a table scarred by years of family meals. Elias Munro sat with his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold, staring at the stack of overdue bills that seemed to multiply each time he looked away. At 47, he carried the weight of a man who had aged a decade in the past 2 years. His dark hair, now streaked with premature silver, fell across eyes that had once sparkled with the easy confidence of a man who believed the world made sense. The kitchen still smelled faintly of Sarah's lavender soap, though she'd been gone 8 months now. Some mornings, Elias would wake and for just a moment expect to hear her humming while she made breakfast. The silence that followed was always worse than the grief itself. "Dad?" Emma's voice drifted down from upstairs, followed by the creak of old floorboards. At 17, she moved through the house like a ghost, trying not to disturb the delicate balance of their shared morning. The lawyer called again. Elias closed his eyes. Robert Henley had been calling twice a week since Marcus Munro's funeral 3 weeks ago, patient but persistent about the reading of the will. Elias had been avoiding it, partly from grief, but mostly from the certainty that his father had left him nothing but disappointment. Their relationship had been fractured for nearly 20 years, broken by Marcus's descent into what the town kindly called eccentricity, and what Elias had come to recognize as obsession. Emma appeared in the doorway, already dressed for school in jeans that were getting too short, and a sweater with a small hole near the left elbow. She had her mother's gentle brown eyes and stubborn chin, but lately she carried herself with a caution that reminded Elias painfully of himself. At her age, the careful movements of someone learning not to hope for too much. "Maybe he left you something useful," she said, though her voice carried no conviction. Everyone in Cedar Hollow knew Marcus Munro had died with nothing but conspiracy theories and a reputation for chasing shadows. "Your grandfather and I," Elias began, then stopped. "How do you explain to your daughter that some wounds run so deep they calcify into permanent distance? That sometimes loving someone means watching them disappear into their own private madness while you stand helplessly by?" Emma poured herself orange juice from a container that was nearly empty. They were down to counting every dollar, measuring every expense against the dwindling savings account that Sarah's medical bills had devoured like a hungry animal. The cancer had taken her slowly, and the treatments had taken everything else. "I know, Dad. You don't have to explain." Emma's voice held the forced maturity of a teenager who had grown up too fast, who had spent her junior year watching her mother fade away, while her father worked double shifts to pay for hope measured in chemotherapy cycles and experimental treatments. The phone rang sharp and insistent. Through the kitchen window, Elias could see Mrs. Patterson from next door, pretending to tend her roses while obviously listening for gossip. Cedar Hollow was the kind of town where everyone knew your business before you did, where a man's troubles became community entertainment and his failures were discussed over coffee at Millie's diner. "Mr. Munro." Robert Henley's voice was professionally patient. "I really do need to see you about your father's estate. There are some unusual circumstances that require immediate attention." Elias watched Emma gather her books, noting how she carefully avoided looking at the bills on the table. "What kind of circumstances?" "It's better discussed in person. Can you come in this afternoon?" "Mr. Henley, my father lived in a trailer with no heat and ate soup from cans. What could he possibly have left that requires immediate attention? There was a pause on the other end of the line. Mr. Monroe, your father owned 47 acres in the Whitmore Valley, mineral rights included. The coffee cup slipped from Elias's fingers, shattering against the linoleum floor in a spray of cold coffee and ceramic fragments. Emma looked up sharply, startled by the crash. That's impossible. He never owned anything except that old trailer. The deed is quite clear, sir. It's been in your family name since 1923, your father. Well, he never developed the property. Most of it appears to be cave systems and rock formations. Not particularly valuable land, but land nonetheless. Elias stared at the broken cup at his feet, watching coffee seep into the cracks between floor tiles that Sarah had always meant to replace. 47 acres. His father, who had died alone in a hospital bed with nothing but the clothes he wore, and a mind full of theories about buried treasure and government conspiracies, had owned 47 acres of Appalachian wilderness. Dad? Emma's voice seemed to come from very far away. What's wrong? I'll be there at 2 o'clock, Elias said into the phone, then hung up without waiting for a response. Emma knelt beside him, carefully picking up the larger pieces of broken ceramic. It's okay, Dad. We'll figure it out. But Elias wasn't thinking about the broken cup or even the mysterious land. He was remembering himself at 10 years old, following his father through dense mountain woods, listening to stories about Confederate gold and hidden fortunes buried deep in the earth. Marcus Monroe had been a different man than before. The obsession consumed him, before he started seeing conspiracies in every coincidence and treasure maps in every old document. Emma, what do you remember about your grandfather? She looked up from the broken pieces in her palm. Not much. He was always kind of intense, always talking about history and showing me old maps. Mom used to say he lived in the past. Sarah had been diplomatic about Marcus, understanding that some family wounds were too deep to heal, but too important to abandon entirely. She had encouraged Elias to maintain some connection with his father, even when Marcus's theories grew more elaborate and his behavior more erratic. He used to take me exploring when I was your age, Elias said, surprised by the gentleness in his own voice. Before everything went wrong between us. He knew every cave and creek in these mountains. He could read the land like other people read books. Emma sat back on her heels, studying her father's face. Maybe this land thing isn't so bad. Maybe it's worth something. Elias almost smiled at her optimism. Honey, if your grandfather had anything valuable, don't you think he would have used it? He died wearing the same clothes he'd worn for 3 days. But even as he said it, Elias felt something stirring in his chest, not hope, exactly, but curiosity. Marcus Monroe had been many things, obsessed, paranoid, difficult, and estranged from his only son. But he had never been stupid. If he had held on to 47 acres of mountain land for decades while living in poverty, there had to be a reason. The brass compass sat in the center of Robert Henley's desk, like an accusation. Elias recognized it immediately, his great-grandfather's mining compass, the one Marcus had carried on their childhood expeditions. The brass was tarnished, but the needle still swung true, pointing steadily north with the reliability of old craftsmanship. Your father left specific instructions, Henley said, sliding the compass across the polished wood surface. He wanted you to have this first, before we discussed the land. Elias picked up the compass, feeling the familiar weight of it in his palm. Engraved on the back in his great-grandfather's careful script were the words, "The garden we kept." It was a phrase Marcus had used sometimes during their explorations, though Elias had never understood what it meant. The land borders the old Whitmore mining operation, Henley continued, spreading a topographical map across his desk. Most of it is inaccessible by vehicle. Steep terrain, dense forest, and significant cave systems. Your father apparently visited the property regularly, though he never built anything on it. Elias studied the map, noting the familiar contour lines and creek patterns. The Whitmore Valley had been logged and mined extensively in the early 1900s, then abandoned when the coal veins played out and the chestnut blight killed the timber. Now it was just another stretch of reclaimed Appalachian wilderness, too remote and rugged for development. Has anyone else expressed interest in the property? Henley's expression shifted slightly. There have been some inquiries. Nothing formal, but, well, word travels fast in a small town. There are always people interested in mountain land, especially if they think there might be mineral deposits. What kind of people? The kind who ask a lot of questions and don't give many answers. Henley leaned back in his chair. Mr. Monroe, I knew your father for 30 years. He was a client long before his theories became so prominent. Whatever drove him to spend so much time on that land, he was very specific about keeping it in the family. Elias turned the compass over in his hands, remembering the weight of it on their long walks through the mountains. Marcus had taught him to read contour maps and follow creek beds, to identify different types of rock formations and understand how water moved through limestone. Those had been good days, before distance and disappointment built walls between them. There's something else, Henley said quietly. Your father left you his personal effects, several boxes of papers, journals, maps. They're in my storage room if you want them. The journals. Elias had forgotten about his father's obsessive note-taking, the careful documentation of every theory and exploration. As a teenager, he had dismissed them as the ramblings of a man losing touch with reality. Now, staring at the compass that had guided 4 generations of Monroe men through these mountains, he wondered if he had been too quick to judge. The afternoon sun was slanting low through the office windows when Elias finally loaded the boxes into his truck. Emma was waiting in the passenger seat, having left school early to join him. She watched silently as he secured the boxes in the truck bed, her expression thoughtful. What do you think, Dad? I think your grandfather was a complicated man who loved these mountains more than he loved the people in his life. Elias started the engine, noting the slight hesitation that meant the truck would need repairs, soon another expense they couldn't afford. But maybe that doesn't make him wrong about everything. As they drove home through the familiar streets of Cedar Hollow, Elias caught glimpses of neighbors watching from their windows and porches. By tomorrow, everyone would know about Marcus Monroe's mysterious land and the boxes of papers his son had inherited. The speculation would start immediately, feeding the town's appetite for gossip and drama. But for the first time in months, Elias felt something other than despair stirring in his chest. It wasn't hope, he was too careful for that, but it was possibility. Marcus Monroe had spent the last 20 years of his life convinced that the mountains held secrets worth searching for. Maybe it was time for his son to find out if he had been right. The truck's engine coughed as Elias navigated the winding dirt road that led into the Whitmore Valley. Emma sat beside him, clutching the brass compass and studying the hand-drawn map they'd found in Marcus's first journal. The trees pressed close on both sides, their branches creating a canopy so thick that midday felt like twilight. "Are you sure this is the right way?" Emma asked, squinting at the faded pencil marks on the yellowed paper. "Your grandfather always took this route when I was your age." Elias remembered the familiar bounce and sway of his father's old pickup, the way Marcus would point out landmarks and share stories about the families who had lived and worked in these mountains generations ago. He said the main logging roads were too obvious. They had spent the previous evening poring over Marcus's journals, deciphering his careful handwriting and studying the dozens of maps he had drawn over the years. Most of it had seemed like the rambling documentation of an obsessed mind-detailed notes about soil composition, water table measurements, and elaborate theories about Civil War gold. But threaded through the apparent madness was a consistent thread of methodical research that spoke to a sharper intellect than Elias had given his father credit for. The road ended abruptly at a rusted chain stretched between 2 oak trees. Beyond the barrier, the forest grew wild and untouched, exactly as Marcus had described in his notes. Elias parked the truck and retrieved the bolt cutters from the toolbox, feeling a strange mix of trespass and homecoming as he cut through the chain that had protected his father's secret for so many years. "Look at this," Emma said, pointing to fresh tire tracks in the soft earth near the tree line. Someone else has been here recently. Elias examined the tracks, noting the deep tread pattern of heavy-duty tire snot, the kind of vehicle a casual hiker would drive into these remote mountains. The tracks led deeper into the woods, following what appeared to be an old mining road that nature was slowly reclaiming. They walked in silence for nearly 20 minutes, following Marcus's mapped route through dense undergrowth and around fallen trees. The compass in Emma's hands spun occasionally, confused by the iron deposits that Marcus had noted in his journals. The air grew cooler as they climbed, carrying the mineral scent of limestone and the earthy richness of mountain soil that never fully dried. Then Emma stopped abruptly, pointing ahead through the trees. "Dad, is that it?" The cave entrance yawned before them like an open mouth, easily 12 feet high and twice as wide. What made Elias's breath catch, however, was not the cave itself, but the evidence of recent activity around it. A canvas tarp stretched between two trees, covering what looked like camping equipment. Fresh boot prints circled the entrance, and someone had cleared away years of accumulated brush and debris. "Someone's been living here," Emma whispered. Elias approached the makeshift camp cautiously, noting the careful organization that spoke to long-term occupation rather than casual exploration. A Coleman lantern sat on a wooden crate beside a sleeping bag that had seen better days. Next to it, spread across a piece of oilcloth, were tools that made Elias's pulse quicken: surveying equipment, geological samples, and a detailed map of the cave system that went far beyond anything in Marcus's journals. But it was the photograph tucked under a corner of the map that stopped him cold. The image showed Marcus Monroe, standing beside the cave entrance, grinning with an expression of triumph that Elias hadn't seen on his father's face in decades. On the back, in Marcus's careful handwriting, was a date from just 2 months before his death and a single word: found. "Dad," Emma's voice carried a tremor of excitement and fear. "You need to see this." She was standing at the cave entrance, holding up what appeared to be a yellowed piece of paper. As Elias approached, he realized it was actually oilcloth wrapped around something flat and rectangular. Emma carefully unfolded the protective covering, revealing a hand-drawn map, unlike anything they had seen in Marcus's journals. The paper was genuinely old, not artificially aged. The ink had faded to a warm brown that spoke of decades or possibly centuries. The drawing showed the cave system in remarkable detail, with passages and chambers marked in a precise hand. But what caught Elias's attention were the notations written in the margins: measurements, compass bearings, and what appeared to be engineering calculations for water flow and structural support. At the bottom of the map, in script that was clearly different from the main drawing, someone had written, "Colonel T. Ashford, 1864. By God's grace, may this burden find worthier hands than mine." "This is a Civil War survey map," Elias said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Your grandfather found an actual Civil War survey map." Emma traced the detailed passages with her finger. "Look at this chamber here. It's marked differently from the others." She pointed to a section deep within the cave system, where someone had drawn what appeared to be a rectangular room, with precise dimensions noted along the edges. Elias studied the markings more carefully. The chamber was positioned at what appeared to be the lowest point of the cave system, accessible only through a series of increasingly narrow passages. Most significantly, the notation beside it read, "Sealed chamber, 40x20x12. Stone and mortar construction. Access via flood passage when water table permits." "A sealed chamber," Emma said, understanding dawning in her voice. "Dad, this isn't just any cave. Someone built something down there." The implications hit Elias like a physical blow. Marcus hadn't been chasing fantasies. He had been following legitimate historical evidence. The conspiracy theories and obsessive behavior had been the symptoms of a man who knew he was right, but couldn't prove it to a world that had already decided he was crazy. As they stood in the filtered sunlight at the cave entrance, Elias found himself seeing his father with new eyes. Marcus Monroe hadn't retreated into madness. He had been conducting serious historical research with the passion of a man who understood the significance of what he was seeking. The tragedy wasn't that he had been wrong, it was that he had been right, and nobody had believed him. "We need to go inside," Emma said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what they were contemplating. Elias looked at his daughter, 17 years old, standing at the threshold of a mystery that had consumed his father's life, and felt the weight of family legacy settling on his shoulders. Marcus Monroe had died before he could finish what he started, but he had left them everything they needed to continue his work: the land, the research, and now this map that proved his theories weren't delusions. "Your grandfather spent 20 years preparing for this moment," Elias said, checking the flashlight he had brought from the truck. "I think we owe it to him to see what he found." The cave entrance was larger than it appeared from outside, with a ceiling that disappeared into darkness above their heads. The air inside was cool and still, carrying the mineral scent of limestone and the faint sound of water moving somewhere in the depths below. Their footsteps echoed strangely, as if the cave were much larger than the beam of their flashlight could reveal. 20 feet inside the entrance, Elias stopped. The cave split into 3 distinct passages, each leading deeper into the mountain. But carved into the stone wall at the junction, almost invisible unless you knew where to look, were symbols that matched the sketches in Marcus's journals. They weren't natural formations or random marks, they were deliberately carved indicators, left by someone who wanted to mark the way. Emma consulted the Civil War map, comparing the cave layout to their current position. "According to this, we want the middle passage. It leads to a chamber where the original mapmaker left supplies." They followed the passage deeper into the mountain, their flashlight beam revealing smooth limestone walls and occasional glimpses of flowstone formations that spoke to the cave's great age. The passage sloped downward gradually, and Elias could hear the sound of moving water growing stronger with each step. Then their light caught something that made them both stop breathing. Fresh boot prints in the soft clay of the cave floor, leading deeper into the darkness ahead of them. Someone else was down here. Someone else was following the same map, seeking the same sealed chamber that had driven Marcus Monroe to spend the last 20 years of his life in obsessive pursuit. Elias felt Emma's hand slip into his, and together they stood at the edge of the unknown, holding a map that might lead to treasure or danger, or simply the truth about a man who had died, convinced that he was on the verge of vindicating a lifetime of searching. Behind them, the cave entrance was a distant circle of grey light. Ahead lay passages that might hold the answers to questions Marcus Monroe had taken to his grave. For the first time since Sarah's death, Elias Monroe felt truly alive. The leather-bound journal lay open on the kitchen table like a roadmap to madness or genius. Elias had been reading Marcus's field notes for 3 hours, and with each page, his understanding of his father shifted like sand beneath his feet. What he had dismissed as conspiracy theories were actually meticulous documentation of historical research that spanned decades. Emma sat across from him, carefully transcribing the most important passages into a notebook with cleaner handwriting. The morning light, streaming through the kitchen window, illuminated pages filled with sketches, measurements, and theories that painted a picture of a man driven not by delusion, but by the certainty that he was close to something extraordinary. "Listen to this entry from 15 years ago," Emma said, reading from her transcription. "March 15th. Found additional confirmation in courthouse records. Colonel Thaddeus Ashford was indeed assigned to paymaster duties in Western Virginia, 1863, 1864. Official records show him missing in action, April 1864, along with 3 wagons of Union gold intended for troop payment in Winchester." Elias looked up from the journal he was studying. "Union gold? I thought the stories were about Confederate treasure." "That's what makes it interesting." Emma flipped through several pages. Grandfather tracked down newspaper articles from 1864. There were reports of Union paymasters going missing throughout Virginia and West Virginia. The assumption was always that Confederate raiders were intercepting the gold shipments. But Marcus Monroe had developed a different theory, one that grew more compelling as Elias read deeper into the research. The missing paymasters weren't being killed by Confederate raiders, they were disappearing intentionally, along with the gold they were supposed to distribute to Union troops. Someone was systematically stealing Union payroll and hiding it, but not for the Confederacy. The phone rang, interrupting Elias's concentration. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize, but the voice on the other end was warm and familiar. "Elias Monroe? This is Clara Whitfield. I was a friend of your father's." Elias remembered Clara, vaguely a retired teacher who had become the town's unofficial historian after spending 40 years collecting stories and documents about Cedar Hollow's past. She had visited Marcus occasionally in his final years, one of the few people who treated his research with respect rather than amusement. "Ms. Whitfield, I'm sorry I haven't called. We've been trying to sort through Dad's things." "That's actually why I'm calling. Marcus brought me some of his research over the years, asked me to verify certain historical facts. I think there are some things you should know about your father's work." An hour later, Clara Whitfield sat in the Monroe kitchen, her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, and her sharp blue eyes examining Marcus's journals with the careful attention of someone who understood their significance. She was smaller than Elias remembered, but she carried herself with the quiet authority of a woman who had spent her life teaching teenagers that history mattered. "Your father wasn't the first person to search those caves," she said, pointing to a passage in one of the journals. "There are records going back to the 1920s of people disappearing in that area, experienced miners, treasure hunters, even a geological survey team in 1955. They went into those caves and never came out." Emma looked up from the journal she was reading. "What happened to them?" "Nobody knows. The caves are dangerous, unstable in places, with underground streams that can flood without warning." But Marcus had a different theory. Clara opened her own notebook, revealing pages of careful research notes. He believed the caves were deliberately engineered to be dangerous, that someone built traps to protect what's hidden inside. Elias felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. What kind of traps? The kind that would require serious engineering knowledge and significant resources to construct. Marcus spent years studying water flow patterns in that cave system. He believed someone diverted underground streams to create controlled flooding in specific passageways, a way to seal off access to deeper chambers. Clara reached into her bag and pulled out a photocopied document that made Elias's breath catch. It was a page from a military engineering manual dated 1864, with detailed diagrams showing how to construct water-based defense systems in cave environments. "Colonel Ashford wasn't just a paymaster," Clara continued. "Before the war, he was a civil engineer. He supervised the construction of canal systems in Ohio and Pennsylvania. He would have known exactly how to engineer a cave system to protect whatever he hid inside." Emma studied the engineering diagrams with the intense focus she usually reserved for her advanced mathematics homework. "These are really sophisticated. Whoever designed this system understood hydraulics and geological pressure points." "More than that," Clara said. Marcus believed Ashford wasn't working alone. The scale of the engineering required multiple people with specialized knowledge. And the amount of gold that went missing during that period, we're not talking about a few $1,000s. Union payroll records suggest the total value could be enormous by today's standards. As if summoned by their conversation about gold and danger, the doorbell rang. Elias opened the front door to find a man in his 50s standing on the porch, dressed in expensive outdoor gear that looked like it had never seen actual outdoor use. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of confident smile that salesmen and politicians wore when they wanted something. "Mr. Monroe, my name is Dale Cruz. I represent a consortium of investors interested in Appalachian land development." He extended a business card that identified him as a consultant for something called Mountain Heritage Acquisitions. I understand you've recently inherited some property in the Whitmore Valley. Elias glanced back toward the kitchen, where Clara and Emma were still studying the journals. I'm not interested in selling. Of course not, but I'd like to discuss some opportunities that might benefit everyone involved. Cruz's smile never wavered, but his eyes were calculating as they took in details of the Monroe house, the peeling paint, the old furniture visible through the doorway, the subtle signs of financial stress that marked a family struggling to make ends meet. What kind of opportunities? Well, remote mountain land can be difficult to develop individually, but with the right backing, the right expertise, some of these old mining properties can be quite profitable. We're particularly interested in properties with historical significance. The phrase sent warning signals through Elias's mind. Historical significance? Oh, you know how it is with these old mountain properties. Always stories about buried treasure and lost fortunes. Most of it's nonsense, of course, but tourists love that kind of thing. Heritage tourism is big business these days. Dale Cruz was fishing, Elias realized. Somehow, he knew or suspected that the Monroe land was connected to more than just family legacy and local folklore. The question was how much he knew and where he had gotten his information. I appreciate the offer, Mr. Cruz, but I'm not ready to make any decisions about the land. Of course, no pressure at all. Cruz handed him a second business card. But if you change your mind, or if you need any assistance with research or development, we have resources that individual landowners typically don't have access to. Sometimes the things that seem impossible to one person become quite manageable with the right support. After Cruz left, Elias returned to the kitchen to find Clara and Emma deep in conversation about cave safety and exploration techniques. Clara looked up as he entered, her expression troubled. Who was that? Someone who wants to buy Dad's land. He mentioned historical significance and heritage tourism. Clara's frown deepened. Your father was very careful about who he shared his research with, but in a small town, it's hard to keep secrets forever. If word is getting out about what Marcus was really looking for, you need to be very careful about who you trust. She gathered her notes and stood to leave, but paused at the kitchen door. Elias, your father spent 20 years of his life on this research. He died believing he was close to proving everything he theorized. But he also died knowing that there were people who would do anything to get their hands on what he was looking for. After Clara left, Elias and Emma sat in the quiet kitchen, surrounded by journals and maps, and the weight of knowledge that felt both precious and dangerous. Outside, the town of Cedar Hollow continued its quiet routines, unaware that the crazy old Monroe family might have been right about their wild theories all along. But somewhere in the back of his mind, Elias couldn't shake the feeling that Dale Cruz's visit wasn't a coincidence. And if people were already watching, already asking questions, then time was running out to find the answers Marcus Monroe had died seeking. The brass signet ring caught the light from Elias's headlamp as he carefully chipped it free from the limestone wall where it had been embedded for over a century and a half. The metal was tarnished black, but the seal was still clearly visibly an eagle, with outstretched wings clutching arrows and an olive branch surrounded by stars, and the inscription, Colonel T. Ashford, Corps of Engineers. This is it, Emma whispered, her voice echoing strangely in the cave chamber. This proves everything Grandfather theorized. They had been exploring the cave system for 3 days, following Marcus's mapped routes and using his research to navigate the increasingly complex network of passages. Each discovery had built upon the last. Tool marks that showed deliberate excavation, stonework that demonstrated engineering skill, and now this physical proof that Colonel Thaddeus Ashford had indeed been in these caves. Elias cleaned the ring carefully with his shirt, revealing intricate details in the metalwork that spoke to both artistic skill and personal significance. This wasn't military-issue equipment, it was a personal possession, something a man would carry as a reminder of who he was and what he stood for. Look at the inscription inside, Emma said, leaning close to examine the ring. TA to MA, 1862, until honor calls us home. His wife, Elias murmured. Marcus's research mentioned that Ashford was married. If he left this here, it means he never expected to come back. The chamber where they found the ring was different from the natural cave formations they had explored earlier. The walls showed clear evidence of human modification, carefully placed support stones, deliberately widened passages, and what appeared to be a sophisticated drainage system that kept the floor dry despite the sound of running water somewhere nearby. But it was Emma who made the discovery that changed everything. While Elias was photographing the ring and the location where they found it, she had been exploring the far end of the chamber with her own flashlight. Her excited whisper drew him across the uneven stone floor to where she knelt beside what appeared to be a natural rock formation. "Dad, this isn't natural stone. Look at the edges." Emma was right. What had appeared to be a limestone outcropping was actually a carefully constructed wall, built with stones that fit together so precisely that the mortar lines were barely visible. Someone had taken extraordinary care to make the construction blend seamlessly with the natural cave environment. "It's a false wall," Elias said, running his hands along the surface. "There's space behind it. I can feel air movement." They spent the next hour examining the wall from every angle, looking for some mechanism or hidden entrance that would allow access to whatever lay beyond. It was Emma who noticed that one of the stones, about chest high and positioned near the center of the wall, had slightly different coloration from those around it. When she pressed against it, the stone moved inward with a soft grinding sound, revealing itself to be a cleverly disguised lever. The movement triggered a counterweight system somewhere within the wall, and a section of stones swung inward like a door, revealing a passage that had been sealed for more than a century. The air that flowed from the hidden passage was different, cooler, and carrying the scent of mineral deposits and old water. Their flashlight beams revealed a descending tunnel that had been carved through solid rock with tools and techniques that spoke to serious engineering expertise. "This is what Grandfather was looking for," Emma said, her voice filled with awe and excitement. "This is why he spent 20 years coming back to these caves." But as they prepared to explore the hidden passage, the sound of voices echoing from somewhere behind them in the cave system made them both freeze. Someone else was in the caves, and they were moving with the confidence of people who knew exactly where they were going. Elias quickly extinguished his headlamp and motioned for Emma to do the same. In the complete darkness of the cave, they could hear the voices more clearly. At least 3 men, talking in low tones about equipment and timing and something called Phase 2 of the operation. "The old man's research was more accurate than we gave him credit for," one voice said, closer now and clearly audible. "His son's been following the same route we mapped last month." "Doesn't matter," replied another voice, this one carrying the authority of leadership. "We have the resources and equipment they don't. Let them do the dangerous exploration work. Then we'll take over when they find what we're looking for." The voices were moving away now, deeper into the cave system, but their message was clear. Elias and Emma were being watched, followed, and used as unknowing scouts for someone else's operation. Everything they discovered was being noted and planned for by people with resources and equipment that an unemployed widower and his teenage daughter couldn't match. They waited in darkness for what felt like hours before finally risking their flashlights again. The hidden passage was still there, still open, still beckoning them deeper into mysteries that Colonel Ashford had died protecting. But now it carried the additional weight of danger from people who were willing to let others take the risks while they claimed the rewards. "We need help," Emma said quietly. "We're in over our heads." Elias knew she was right. They were dealing with something far more complex and dangerous than family history and local folklore. The engineering required to build the cave modifications they had discovered spoke to resources and expertise that went far beyond what one Confederate officer could have managed alone. And the people following them weren't casual treasure hunters, they were organized and well-funded. But they were also his father's legacy, and Emma's future, and possibly the answer to financial problems that had no other solution. Walking away now meant abandoning everything Marcus Monroe had worked toward, everything he had believed in strongly enough to die pursuing. Your mother had a cousin, Elias said finally. Tommy Castellanos. He served in the Navy, worked with explosives and underwater construction. If anyone would know how to safely explore an engineered cave system, it would be him. Emma looked at her father with a mixture of relief and determination. You think he'd help us? I think he'd help Sarah's family if we asked him to. Elias took one last look at the hidden passage, memorizing its location and the mechanism that opened it. But first, we need to understand exactly what we're dealing with. Your grandfather's research goes deeper than what we've read so far. As they made their way back through the cave system toward the entrance, Elias found himself thinking about the ring in his pocket and the voices they had heard in the darkness. Colonel Ashford had left more than treasure in these caves. She had left a mystery that someone was willing to kill for, and a test that would determine whether the Monroe family was strong enough to claim what their father had died seeking. The afternoon sun felt almost blinding after hours in the cave darkness, but it also felt like hope. They had proof, now physical evidence, that Marcus Monroe's theories were based on historical fact. The Confederate ring was more than just an artifact. It was validation of 20 years of research and the key to understanding that they were dealing with something far more significant than local legend. But it was also proof that they were running out of time. If other people knew about the caves and had the resources to claim whatever lay hidden in the depths, then the Monroe family needed to move quickly and carefully. As they drove home through the mountain roads, Elias made a decision that would have seemed impossible just a week earlier. It was time to trust someone else with the secret that had consumed his father's life. It was time to find out if Tommy Castellanos was still the kind of man who would risk everything to help family. The hydraulic engineering schematic spread across Tommy Castellanos' kitchen table looked like something from a textbook on advanced water management, not a hand-drawn plan from the Civil War era. Tommy studied the detailed drawings with the focused attention of a man who had spent 15 years working with underwater explosives and cave diving systems for the Navy. "This is sophisticated work," he said, tracing the flow lines with his finger. "Whoever designed this understood hydraulic pressure, water table dynamics, and structural engineering at a level that would be impressive today, much less in 1864. Elias watched his late wife's cousin examine the schematic they had found hidden behind a loose stone in Marcus's workshop. Tommy was younger than Elias by 5 years, with the lean build and careful movements of someone accustomed to working in dangerous environments. His dark hair was graying at the temples, and his hands bore the scars of a career spent handling explosives and underwater equipment. "The principle is actually elegant," Tommy continued. "They diverted an underground river through a series of chambers and channels. During normal conditions, the water follows this main route." He pointed to a heavy line on the drawing. "But if someone tries to access the protected chambers down here, the system can be triggered to flood specific passages." Emma leaned over the table, studying the complex network of water channels and chambers. "How would they trigger it?" "Several ways. Weight, activated mechanisms, manually operated gates, even timed systems using water pressure. But the real genius is here." Tommy indicated a series of smaller chambers positioned above the main passage. "These are equalization chambers. They prevent the floodwater from backing up and drowning the people who activate the system." The schematic was more than just an engineering diagram. It was proof that Colonel Ashford had been working with other people who possessed advanced technical knowledge. The level of planning and construction required would have taken months or years to complete, with resources that went far beyond what a single military officer could command. "There's something else," Elias said, spreading Marcus's most recent journal across the table. "Dad figured out how to safely navigate the system. He spent the last 2 years of his life mapping the water flow patterns and timing the flood cycles." Tommy read Marcus's notes with growing amazement. The older man had approached the engineering challenge with the methodical patience of a scientist, documenting water levels during different seasons, calculating pressure differentials, and identifying safe windows when the flood passages could be navigated. "Your father was brilliant," Tommy said quietly. "This is professional-level hydrological analysis." He figured out that the system follows natural water table fluctuations. During dry seasons, when the underground river runs low, there's a 3-hour window when the flood passages drain enough to allow safe passage. But only if you know exactly when and where to go, Emma added, pointing to Marcus's careful timing calculations, and only if you have the right equipment. Tommy nodded. Cave diving gear, underwater breathing apparatus, and probably some kind of mechanical system to operate the original gates. This isn't something you attempt with flashlights and rope. The conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door that made all three of them tense. Through the kitchen window, they could see a black SUV parked in Tommy's driveway, expensive and out of place in the working-class neighborhood where Tommy had lived since leaving the Navy. Dale Cruz stood on the front porch, accompanied by two men in dark suits who looked like they spent their time in corporate boardrooms rather than Appalachian mountains. His smile was as confident as before, but his eyes held a harder edge that suggested patience was wearing thin. "Mr. Monroe," Cruz said when Tommy opened the door, "I was hoping we could continue our conversation about your father's property." "I told you I wasn't interested in selling," Elias replied, acutely aware of the journals and schematics spread across the kitchen table just a few feet away. "Of course, but circumstances have a way of changing, don't they?" Cruz's gaze moved past Elias to take in the kitchen, noting the presence of Emma and Tommy and the papers covering the table. "I understand you've been exploring the old mining areas. Dangerous work for amateurs." The implied threat was subtle but unmistakable. Cruz knew exactly what they were doing and wanted them to know that they were being watched. More concerning was his use of the word amateurs. It suggested that whatever organization he represented considered cave exploration and historical research to be professional activities requiring proper resources and expertise. "Mr. Cruz," Tommy said, stepping forward with the calm authority of someone accustomed to dangerous confrontations, "I think you should leave." "Of course, but before I go, I want to make sure Mr. Monroe understands the full scope of what he's dealing with." Cruz reached into his jacket and pulled out a folder containing photographs that made Elias's blood run cold. The photos showed the cave entrance, the hidden camp they had discovered, and detailed images of the passages they had explored. Someone had been documenting their every move with professional surveillance equipment, capturing not just their activities, but the specific locations and discoveries they had made. "Cave exploration can be very dangerous," Cruz continued conversationally. "People get lost, equipment fails, underground streams flood unexpectedly. Accidents happen all the time, especially to people who don't have proper training and support." Emma moved closer to her father, and Elias felt the protective anger that had sustained him through Sarah's illness flare into something harder and more focused. These people weren't just threatening him, they were threatening his daughter. "What do you want?" Elias asked quietly. "Partnership. Your father spent 20 years developing research that could be very valuable to the right people. We have the resources to properly explore and develop whatever he discovered. Everyone benefits. And if we refuse?" Cruz's smile never wavered. "Well, as I said, cave exploration is dangerous work. It would be tragic if something happened to interrupt your research." After Cruz and his associates left, the three sat in Tommy's kitchen, surrounded by evidence of a mystery that had suddenly become much more dangerous. The photographs had made it clear that they were dealing with people who had significant resources and no apparent concern about legal or ethical boundaries. "We're not equipped for this," Emma said, her voice steady but thoughtful. "They have professional surveillance, corporate backing, and they're not afraid to threaten us directly." Tommy gathered the engineering schematics and Marcus's journals into a neat stack. "Your father anticipated this. Look at his final entries. He knew other people were searching for what he was looking for. That's why he hid his research in multiple locations and never documented everything in one place." Elias studied his father's careful handwriting, seeing new layers of meaning in notes he had initially dismissed as paranoid rambling. Marcus Monroe hadn't been suffering from conspiracy theories, had been documenting an actual conspiracy to steal the fruits of his legitimate historical research. "There's something else," Tommy said, opening the final journal to a page marked with a small piece of tape. Your father left instructions for exactly this situation. He knew that if he died before completing his work, someone would try to take over his research. The page contained detailed directions to 3 separate locations where Marcus had hidden backup copies of his most important discoveries. But more than that, it contained a plan for safely accessing the flooded chambers using equipment and techniques that would allow a small, motivated team to succeed where larger, better-funded operations would fail. He designed a way for his family to claim what he found, Tommy said quietly, but only if they were willing to trust each other and work together. Elias looked at his daughter and his late wife's cousin, realizing that Marcus Monroe's final gift hadn't been just land, and research it had been the foundation for the kind of family alliance that could survive threats and challenges that would destroy individuals working alone. "Then that's what we'll do," Elias said. "We'll finish what my father started, and we'll do it before these people can stop us." For the first time since Sarah's death, Elias Monroe felt like he was part of something larger than his own grief and struggle. He was part of a family legacy that was worth fighting for, and he wasn't fighting alone. The leather Bible felt ancient in Emma's hands as she carefully opened it in the basement workshop they had discovered behind a false wall in their own home. Marcus Monroe had been even more secretive than they had realized, creating a hidden research center beneath their feet where he had spent years analyzing historical documents and planning his final assault on the mystery that had consumed his life. The workshop was a revelation in itself, walls lined with detailed maps, geological surveys, and historical documents that painted a picture of research far more sophisticated than anything they had found in his journals. But it was the Bible, hidden in a specially constructed compartment, that held the final piece of the puzzle they had been assembling. "Look at this," Emma said, her voice filled with wonder as she discovered that the Bible's pages had been carefully hollowed out to create a hiding place. Inside the carved space lay a folded piece of paper and a small brass key attached to a chain that had obviously been worn around someone's neck for years. Elias examined the key while Emma unfolded the paper, revealing handwriting that was different from any they had seen in Marcus's research. The script was formal and careful, written with the kind of precision that spoke to military training and education. "It's a letter," Emma said, reading slowly, "dated April 15th, 1864. To whoever finds this record of my actions, may God forgive what necessity has compelled me to do. I am Colonel Thaddeus Ashford, and I have stolen from my own army to prevent a greater theft." Tommy leaned closer as Emma continued reading. The letter was a confession, but not the kind they had expected. Colonel Ashford hadn't been a Confederate sympathizer stealing Union gold. He had been a Union officer who discovered that his own superiors were systematically looting military payrolls intended for soldiers in the field. "The war has created opportunities for men of weak character to enrich themselves while brave soldiers go unpaid," Emma read. "I have documentation of systematic theft reaching to the highest levels of military command. Rather than allow this corruption to continue, I have secured the evidence and the stolen funds in a place where honest men might someday use them for proper purposes." The implications were staggering. Ashford hadn't been hiding. Confederate treasure he had been protecting Union payroll and evidence of military corruption from the very people who were supposed to be fighting for justice and freedom. He had died not as a traitor, but as a man trying to preserve honor in the face of systematic dishonesty. "There's more," Emma said, turning the page. "He describes the vault construction and the people who helped him. Engineers, miners, local civilians who believed in what he was doing. This wasn't just one man's project, it was an organized effort to preserve evidence and resources until the war ended and proper authorities could address the corruption." But the most significant revelation came in the letter's final paragraphs, where Ashford described the dual nature of what he had hidden. The vault contained not just gold and currency, but detailed documentation of the corruption network names, dates, amounts, and evidence that would have been explosive if it had reached the right people in 1864. I pray that whoever finds this will have the courage to use both the resources and the evidence for purposes that honor the sacrifice of honest soldiers. Emma read. The key opens not just the vault, but a responsibility to see justice done. Tommy had been studying the geological surveys on Marcus's workshop walls, while Emma read the letter. Your father figured out something important, he said, pointing to a series of calculations written in Marcus's careful handwriting. The vault isn't just hidden, it's designed to require multiple people working together to access it safely. The engineering was even more sophisticated than they had realized. The brass key Emma held was only one part of a three-component security system. The compass and the Confederate ring they had found were the other pieces, each one necessary to navigate different stages of the vault's protection mechanisms. It's brilliant, Tommy continued. Ashford designed it so that no single person could access the vault alone. You need the compass to navigate the water-filled passages, the ring to identify the correct chamber, and the key to open the final seal. But more than that, you need at least 3 people working in coordination to operate the flood control systems safely. Emma looked up from the letter with an expression of dawning understanding. Grandfather knew this. That's why he never tried to complete the exploration alone, even after he figured out the water system. He was waiting for family to help him. The realization brought both hope and additional pressure. Marcus Monroe had spent 20 years preparing for a family expedition that would require trust, coordination, and shared risk. He had died before he could explain this to his son, leaving behind only clues and hoping that Elias would eventually understand what was required. But their planning was interrupted by the sound of heavy vehicles outside and the glow of headlights through the basement windows. Emma quickly gathered the Bible and letter, while Elias extinguished the workshop lights. Through the narrow basement windows, they could see multiple SUVs and what appeared to be a commercial van equipped with industrial equipment. They're not waiting anymore, Tommy said quietly. Whatever timeline they were following, they've moved up their schedule. The sound of power tools and heavy machinery made it clear that Dale Cruz and his organization were no longer interested in surveillance and intimidation. They were preparing for a full-scale extraction operation, using resources that would allow them to bypass the careful research and patient exploration that the Monroe family had been conducting. They're going to destroy everything, Emma said, her voice tight with anger. All of Grandfather's work. All the historical significance, all the evidence that Colonel Ashford died protecting. Elias felt the same rage that had sustained him through Sarah's medical battles flare into cold determination. These people were willing to destroy a century and a half of hidden history for immediate profit, treating the sacrifice and courage of men like Marcus Monroe and Thaddeus Ashford as obstacles to be eliminated rather than legacies to be honored. Not if we get there first, he said quietly. Tommy was already gathering equipment from his own storage area's cave diving gear, underwater breathing apparatus, and portable lighting systems that would allow them to navigate the flooded passages safely. But more than equipment, he brought the kind of tactical thinking that came from years of military operations in dangerous environments. We have advantages they don't, Tommy said as they prepared to leave through the back of the house, avoiding the surveillance outside. We know the cave system, we understand the engineering, and we have the tools to access the vault properly. Most importantly, we're not trying to extract everything at once, we just need to secure the evidence and enough resources to prove what we've found. As they made their way through the dark streets of Cedar Hollow, avoiding the main roads where Cruz's people might be watching, Elias realized that they were about to attempt something that would either vindicate his father's life work or end in disaster for everyone he cared about. But for the first time since Sarah's death, he was part of something that felt larger than personal loss and struggle. He was carrying forward a mission that connected him to his father, his daughter, and men like Colonel Ashford, who had risked everything to do what they believed was right. The cave system, waiting in the darkness, held more than treasure-it, held the test of whether the Monroe family was strong enough to claim the legacy that Marcus Monroe had died protecting. The corporate survey document lay spread across the hood of Tommy's truck like an indictment written in professional language and geological terminology. Emma had found it tucked inside Dale Cruz's briefcase, which had been carelessly left in his SUV while he supervised the equipment setup at the cave entrance. The document bore the letterhead of Blackstone Mining Consortium and was dated 6 months before Marcus Monroe's death. "They've known about the vault the entire time," Emma said, her voice shaking with anger as she read from the detailed geological report. "Listen to this. Ground-penetrating radar confirms the presence of artificial chambers at depths consistent with Civil War-era construction. Estimated value of contents, $150 million, based on historical gold prices and documented missing union payroll." Elias felt the world shift beneath his feet as the implications became clear. Dale Cruz wasn't an opportunistic treasure hunter who had learned about the cave through local gossip, represented a corporation that had been systematically researching and planning this operation for years. More disturbing was the timeline. They had been watching Marcus Monroe long before his death. Tommy examined the document with the methodical attention of someone trained to analyze intelligence reports. "Look at this section here," he said, pointing to a paragraph marked Phase 1 Implementation. "They've been manipulating events to force your family into a position where you'd be desperate enough to do the dangerous exploration work for them." The corporate strategy was as cold as it was effective. Blackstone Mining had identified Marcus Monroe as the person most likely to solve the cave's engineering challenges, but they needed him to be desperate enough to take risks that a cautious researcher would avoid. So they had orchestrated a series of pressures designed to force him into increasingly reckless behavior. "They killed him," Emma said quietly, reading from a section labeled Asset Elimination Protocol. "Dad, they murdered grandfather." The document didn't use those words, but the clinical language made the reality clear. Marcus Monroe's death hadn't been natural, it had been facilitated. When his research reached a point where Blackstone could benefit from inheriting his work, rather than waiting for him to complete it safely. But the conspiracy went deeper than they had imagined. As Elias read through the detailed corporate planning documents, he discovered that Sarah's cancer treatment had also been manipulated. Blackstone had connections with medical facilities and insurance companies that allowed them to artificially inflate treatment costs and create the kind of financial desperation that would make a grieving widower willing to risk everything for a chance at sudden wealth. "They've been orchestrating our lives," Elias said, his voice hollow with shock. "Sarah's medical bills, the timing of Dad's death, even the lawyer's pressure to settle the estate quickly. It's all been designed to put us in exactly the position we're in right now." Tommy found the most disturbing revelation in a section labeled Monroe Family Asset Assessment. The document contained detailed psychological profiles of Elias and Emma, analyzing their personalities, financial situation, and emotional vulnerabilities to predict how they would respond to various pressures and incentives. "They know everything about us," Emma said, reading her own psychological profile with a mixture of fascination and revulsion. "Our financial situation, my college plans, even Dad's grief patterns and decision-making tendencies. They've been studying us like laboratory animals." The corporate planning was sophisticated enough to account for multiple contingencies. If the Monroe family succeeded in accessing the vault, Blackstone would simply take it from them, using legal mechanisms they had already put in place. If the family failed and died in the attempt, Blackstone would inherit the research and hire professional teams to complete the work safely. But there was one element of Marcus Monroe's research that Blackstone hadn't fully understood: the moral dimension of what Colonel Ashford had hidden. The corporate documents focused entirely on the monetary value of the gold and artifacts, completely ignoring the historical evidence of military corruption that Ashford had died protecting. "They don't know about the documents," Elias realized, studying the corporate inventory projections. "They think they're just looking for gold and artifacts. They have no idea that the real treasure is the evidence of systematic corruption that could expose similar activities happening today." Tommy was examining a different section of the corporate document's technical specifications for the equipment Blackstone planned to use for large-scale extraction. "They're not interested in preserving anything," he said grimly. "They're planning to use industrial excavation equipment that will destroy the cave system and anything in it that doesn't have immediate monetary value." The realization transformed their mission from treasure hunting to historical preservation. They weren't just racing to claim their family's inheritance, they were fighting to protect evidence that could expose corporate and governmental corruption spanning more than a century. "There's something else," Emma said, finding a loose page that had been paper-clipped to the main document. "It's a list of other sites." "Dad, they're not just after Grandfather's Cave. They're systematically looting historical sites across Appalachia." The list contained locations in 5 states, each one associated with Civil War-era treasure stories, and each one marked with assessment codes that indicated various stages of development. Some sites were marked as completed extraction, others as research phase, and still others as asset acquisition in progress. Blackstone Mining wasn't just a treasure hunting operation. It was an organized system for identifying, researching, and looting historical sites, using corporate resources and legal manipulation to avoid traditional ethical and legal constraints. "We have to stop them," Emma said with the fierce determination that reminded Elias so powerfully of Sarah. "Not just here, but everywhere they're doing this." But even as they absorbed the magnitude of what they were facing, the sound of approaching vehicles reminded them that time was running out. Blackstone's equipment was already in position at the cave entrance, and their window for accessing the vault ahead of the corporate team was closing rapidly. Tommy gathered the documents and equipment with military efficiency. "We have 2 advantages they don't know about," he said. "First, we know they're coming, and we know their timeline. Second, we have the moral authority that comes from protecting something rather than just stealing it." As they prepared for what would be their final attempt to reach the vault before Blackstone destroyed everything, Marcus Monroe and Colonel Ashford had worked to preserve. Elias found himself thinking about the different kinds of inheritance his father had left him. The land and the research were valuable, but the real legacy was the understanding that some things were worth fighting for, even when the odds were overwhelming. Marcus Monroe had spent 20 years of his life protecting historical truth from people who would exploit it for profit. Now that responsibility fell to his son and granddaughter. "Your grandfather didn't just leave us a treasure," Elias told Emma as they made their final preparations. "He left us a mission. Colonel Ashford died protecting evidence of corruption, and your grandfather died trying to make sure that evidence reached people who would use it properly." Emma nodded, understanding that they were about to risk everything, not just for financial security, but for the principle that history belonged to the people rather than to corporations, with enough resources to claim it by force. The cave system waiting in the darkness held more than gold and artifacts. It held the test of whether ordinary people could still fight powerful organizations and win through courage, preparation, and the willingness to risk everything for principles that mattered more than personal survival. As they approached the cave through the forest paths that Marcus Monroe had mapped so carefully, Elias Monroe realized that he was finally ready to be the kind of man his father had believed. He could become someone willing to fight for family, for history, and for the idea that truth was more valuable than treasure. The hidden audio recorder had been waiting for them in the deepest chamber they had explored so far, tucked behind a loose stone, exactly where Marcus Monroe's final map indicated it would be. Emma's hands trembled slightly as she pressed the play button on the small digital device, and suddenly her grandfather's voice filled the cave chamber with the weight of final words spoken by a man who knew he was running out of time. "If you're hearing this, then I'm gone, and you've followed my research far enough to understand what we're really dealing with." Marcus's voice was steady but tired, carrying the exhaustion of a man who had carried a secret burden for too long. "I'm going to tell you everything I couldn't put in the written records. The things too dangerous to document until the moment when documentation becomes necessary." Elias closed his eyes, hearing his father's voice for the first time since their last bitter argument 3 years earlier. The anger and disappointment that had defined their relationship for so long seemed insignificant compared to the courage and dedication revealed in Marcus's final recording. The vault contains more than gold, more than artifacts, more than evidence of Civil War corruption, Marcus continued. I've been tracking the same corporate network that Colonel Ashford was fighting, and it didn't end with the Civil War. The systematic theft and corruption has continued for over a century, growing and adapting, but never disappearing. Tommy and Emma listened intently as Marcus described connections between 19th century military corruption and modern corporate practices that created a pattern of exploitation spanning generations. The evidence in Colonel Ashford's vault wasn't just historical, it was the foundation for understanding ongoing criminal activities that reached into contemporary business and government. Blackstone Mining Consortium is the current incarnation of the same network that Ashford was fighting in 1864, Marcus's voice explained. They've been systematically looting historical sites and artifacts, using corporate legal structures to claim ownership of things that belong to the American people. But more than that, they're using the same techniques of manipulation and intimidation that corrupt military officers used during the Civil War. The recording revealed that Marcus had been in contact with federal investigators who were building a case against Blackstone's activities across multiple states. His research wasn't just family genealogy, it was part of a larger law enforcement operation that required evidence from the vault to prove historical patterns of criminal behavior. I've hidden copies of my correspondence with the FBI in 3 locations, Marcus continued. If something happens to me, you'll need those documents to prove that accessing the vault isn't theft. It's the completion of a federal investigation that I didn't live to finish. Emma found herself crying as she listened to her grandfather explain precautions he had taken to protect his family from the consequences of his research. Marcus Monroe hadn't been a paranoid conspiracy theorist, had been a careful investigator who understood exactly how dangerous his discoveries were and had planned accordingly. The vault access requires 3 people working in perfect coordination, Marcus's voice continued. Not just because of the engineering, but because Ashford designed it to require trust and shared commitment. He wanted to make sure that only people working together for the right reasons could claim what he had protected. The recording included detailed instructions for navigating the flood control system, using the 3 artifacts they had collected, and timing their approach to coincide with the natural water cycles that Marcus had spent years documenting. But more than technical instructions, it provided the emotional guidance that Marcus had never been able to give his son in life. Elias, I know I wasn't the father you deserved. I let my obsession with this mystery consume our relationship, and I'll regret that for whatever time I have left. But I need you to understand that everything I did was because I believed this was important enough to sacrifice for, not the money, the principle. The idea that truth and justice matter more than power and profit. As the recording continued, Marcus described countermeasures he had prepared for exactly the situation they now faced. Blackstone's corporate operation relied on overwhelming resources and legal intimidation, but it had vulnerabilities that a small, motivated team could exploit. They expect you to be victims, Marcus explained. They've planned for you to do the dangerous work and then step aside when they claim the results. But they haven't planned for you to fight back with the same determination and intelligence that got you to the vault in the first place. The final section of the recording contained specific instructions for documenting everything they found in the vault and transmitting it to law enforcement contacts before Blackstone could interfere. Marcus had established secure communication channels and legal protections that would allow his family to expose the conspiracy without becoming targets themselves. Remember, Marcus's voice concluded, you're not just claiming an inheritance, you're completing a mission that men have been dying for since 1864. Colonel Ashford, me, and probably others whose names we'll never know, don't let their sacrifice be meaningless. The recording ended with the soft click of the device shutting off, leaving the three of them sitting in the cave chamber with the weight of revelation and responsibility. Outside, they could hear the distant sound of heavy machinery and voices carrying the authority of people accustomed to taking whatever they wanted. "How much time do we have?" Emma asked, checking her watch against the water cycle calculations Marcus had provided. Tommy consulted the hydraulic charts and timing tables. "The next safe window opens in 2 hours and lasts for approximately 90 minutes. After that, the water levels rise too high to navigate the flood passages safely. And if we miss it, we wait another 6 days for the next opportunity, assuming Blackstone doesn't complete their extraction operation first." The timeline was tight, but it was possible. More importantly, they now understood that success wasn't just about reaching the vault, it was about documenting everything they found and transmitting that documentation to the right people before anyone could stop them. Elias found himself thinking about the different kinds of courage his father had demonstrated. Marcus Monroe had spent 20 years preparing for a mission he might not live to complete, trusting that his family would have the strength to finish what he started. That took a different kind of bravery than the physical courage required to navigate dangerous cave systems. It required faith in family bonds that had been strained by years of misunderstanding. "Your grandfather left us everything we need," Elias told Emma as they prepared for their final descent into the protected chambers. "Equipment, information, legal protection, and most importantly, a clear understanding of why this matters." Emma nodded, but her expression carried the thoughtful seriousness of someone who understood they were about to attempt something that would either vindicate generations of Monroe family sacrifice or end in disaster for everyone they cared about. Tommy was making final adjustments to their diving equipment and communication systems, preparing for an operation that would require military-level precision and coordination. "Once we enter the flood passages, we're committed," he said quietly. "The water system won't allow retreat if something goes wrong." As they gathered their equipment and prepared to descend deeper into the cave system than any of them had ever gone, Elias found himself thinking about Sarah and the strength she had shown during her final illness. She had faced impossible odds with grace and determination, never complaining about circumstances she couldn't control, but fighting fiercely for the things that mattered most. Now he was being asked to show the same kind of courage, to risk everything for principles that were more important than personal safety or immediate gratification. The difference was that this time, he wasn't fighting alone. He was part of a family alliance that connected him to his father, his daughter, and men like Colonel Ashford, who had chosen truth over comfort and justice over profit. "Whatever happens down there," Elias said as they prepared to enter the final passages, "we're finishing something that was started by better men than us. That has to count for something." The cave system ahead held more than treasure or evidence. It held the test of whether ordinary people could still challenge powerful institutions and win through preparation, courage, and the willingness to trust each other when everything was at stake. Above them, Blackstone's corporate extraction team was preparing to destroy everything that Marcus Monroe and Colonel Ashford had died protecting. Below them, the flooded chambers waited with secrets that could expose more than a century of corruption and exploitation. The next 2 hours would determine whether justice was still possible when powerful people were determined to prevent it. The brass key turned in the ancient lock with a sound like destiny clicking into place. Colonel Ashford's war chest sat before them in the underwater chamber, exactly where Marcus Monroe's research had predicted it would be, protected by engineering that had kept it safe for over a century and a half. Emma's underwater camera flashed as she documented everything: the chest itself, the chamber construction, and the remarkable preservation of artifacts that should have deteriorated decades ago. The chamber was a marvel of Civil War-era engineering, with ventilation systems and moisture control that spoke to knowledge far beyond what most people associated with 1860s technology. But it was the contents of the chest that took their breath away. Gold bars stamped with Union Mint marks lay beside stacks of currency in denominations they had never seen, perfectly preserved in oiled leather wrappings. More importantly, document cases made of treated metal contained papers that Marcus Monroe had died, trying to protect evidence of corruption that reached from Civil War battlefields to modern corporate boardrooms. "Look at this," Elias said, his voice muffled by the underwater breathing apparatus as he carefully extracted a leather portfolio from the chest. Inside were detailed records of systematic theft from Union military payrolls, complete with names, dates, and amounts that painted a picture of corruption involving dozens of high-ranking officers. Emma photographed each document methodically, following the procedure Marcus had outlined in his recording. The evidence was extraordinary, not just proof of Civil War-era corruption, but documentation of how stolen resources had been used to establish business enterprises that continued operating under different names through the decades that followed. But the most shocking discovery was a modern addition to the historical documents papers in Marcus Monroe's handwriting that connected the Civil War corruption network to contemporary criminal activities. Marcus had traced the same families and corporate entities through multiple generations, documenting how techniques developed during wartime had evolved into sophisticated modern fraud operations. "Blackstone Mining Consortium is just the latest name," Elias said, reading from his father's careful analysis. "The same corporate structure has been operating under different identities for over 100 years, always adapting to new legal environments, but never changing its basic approach to theft and intimidation." Tommy's voice crackled through their communication system with urgency that made them all freeze. "We have a problem up here. Crew's team just broke through the cave defenses. They're coming down with heavy equipment, and they're not being careful about preservation." The sound of explosions echoing through the water-filled passages confirmed Tommy's warning. Blackstone's extraction team was using industrial methods that would destroy the cave system's delicate engineering and probably kill anyone caught in the passages when the water levels shifted unpredictably. "How much time do we have?" Emma asked, continuing to photograph documents even as the water around them began to vibrate from the explosions above. "Minutes, not hours," Tommy replied. "They've brought enough equipment to drain the entire passage system, but they're doing it without understanding the flood control mechanisms. The whole system is becoming unstable." Elias made the decision that would define everything that followed. Instead of trying to carry the physical gold and artifacts to safety, he focused on documenting the evidence that could expose Blackstone's criminal network. The money was valuable, but the documents were irreplaceable, and they were what Colonel Ashford and Marcus Monroe had really died protecting. "Emma, focus on the corruption evidence. Photograph everything that connects historical crimes to modern activities." Elias sealed the most important documents in waterproof cases while his daughter worked with the systematic precision she had inherited from her grandfather. The chamber was flooding more rapidly now, as Blackstone's industrial pumping systems disrupted the careful balance that had protected the vault for generations. But Emma's training in advanced mathematics and her grandfather's methodical research techniques allowed her to identify and prioritize the most crucial evidence, even under extreme pressure. "I've got it," she said finally, sealing her cameras and the most important documents in waterproof containers. "Everything we need to prove the connection between historical corruption and modern crimes." The exit from the chamber required precise timing and perfect coordination, exactly as Marcus Monroe had described in his instructions. But the explosions above had created new hazards, and the water pressure was changing in ways that made their planned route increasingly dangerous. "We're not getting out the way we came in," Tommy's voice warned them. "But your father's research includes an emergency exit route. It's more dangerous, but it's the only option now." As they prepared to navigate passages that Marcus Monroe had mapped but never attempted, Elias found himself thinking about the different kinds of inheritance his father had actually left them. The gold and artifacts were valuable, but the real treasure was the understanding that some things were worth risking everything to protect. Emma swam beside him with the determination and grace that reminded him so powerfully of Sarah, carrying evidence that could expose corruption spanning multiple generations. She wasn't just her grandfather's heir. She was the completion of a mission that connected their family to men like Colonel Ashford, who had chosen justice over safety. The flooded passages ahead would test everything Marcus Monroe had taught them about courage, preparation, and the willingness to trust each other when survival depended on perfect coordination. Sarah's wedding ring glinted in the underwater chamber's artificial lighting as Elias discovered it, wrapped in oiled cloth inside a small metal box that Marcus had hidden beneath the main treasure chest. His breath caught as he realized what it meant. This father had somehow recovered the ring after Sarah's death and placed it here, in the heart of the mystery that had consumed his life. As a final gift to the family, he had never learned how to show he loved. The ring was more than jewelry. It was Marcus Monroe's way of saying that love and family were the real treasures worth fighting for. That all his research and sacrifice had been motivated not by greed, but by the desire to leave something meaningful for the people who would carry on after he was gone. But their moment of discovery was shattered by the sound of diving equipment and voices echoing through the flooded passages. Dale Cruz and his team had followed them into the vault chamber, using military-grade underwater gear and enough firepower to handle any resistance they might encounter. "Well, Mr. Monroe," Cruz's voice carried clearly through the water, amplified by professional communication equipment. "I have to admit, your family's research was more accurate than we anticipated. You've saved us considerable time and expense." Emma moved protectively close to her father, but she continued sealing documents and evidence in waterproof containers with the methodical precision that Marcus Monroe had taught her through years of patient instruction. Even facing immediate danger, she understood that preserving the evidence was more important than personal safety. "The gold is impressive," Cruz continued, examining the contents of Colonel Ashford's war chest with professional assessment. "But what we're really interested in are the documents your grandfather was so careful to protect. Certain parties would pay very well to make sure that historical evidence never reaches the wrong hands." The confrontation in the flooded chamber was surreal. Two teams of underwater explorers facing off over treasure and evidence that had been hidden since the Civil War. But the technological advantage clearly belonged to Blackstone's corporate team, with equipment and resources that the Monroe family couldn't match. "You're going to give us the documents," Cruz said, his tone carrying the authority of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted through intimidation. "And then you're going to forget everything you've learned about our business operations. In return, we'll make sure you have enough resources to live comfortably and never worry about money again." Emma's response was to activate Marcus Monroe's emergency drainage system, a backup mechanism he had discovered and modified to create exactly this kind of opportunity. Water began rushing out of the chamber through hidden channels, dropping the water level and creating the kind of chaos that favored people who understood the cave system over those who relied purely on superior equipment. In the confusion that followed, Tommy's voice crackled through their communication system with news that changed everything. "I've got backup arriving FBI teams that Marcus was working with. They've been tracking Blackstone for months, waiting for exactly this kind of evidence." The drainage system worked exactly as Marcus had designed it, creating a tactical advantage for people who understood its operation, while leaving Blackstone's team struggling with equipment that wasn't designed for rapidly changing water levels. Emma used the confusion to secure the most important evidence, while Elias confronted Dale Cruz directly. "This ends here," Elias said, finding courage he hadn't known he possessed. "The corruption, the intimidation, the systematic theft of American history, it all ends with what we've found in this chamber." But Cruz wasn't finished. As the water continued draining and the chamber became accessible to surface teams, he revealed the full extent of Blackstone's resources and connections. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," he said. "This operation has backing at levels you can't imagine. Federal investigations can be redirected, evidence can disappear, and accidents can happen to families who don't understand their place in the larger scheme of things." The threat was clear and immediate, but it was also Cruz's fatal mistake. His admission of federal corruption and willingness to threaten a family was being recorded by Emma's equipment and transmitted to law enforcement teams that Marcus Monroe had spent years cultivating. Actually, Tommy's voice said as he emerged from the passage leading to the surface. "We know exactly who we're dealing with, and so do the FBI teams that have been listening to everything you just said." The cave chamber filled with law enforcement personnel who had been waiting for exactly this moment, the completion of an investigation that Marcus Monroe had begun and died trying to finish. Dale Cruz and his team found themselves surrounded by people with more authority and better equipment than anything Blackstone Mining Consortium could field. Emma held up the waterproof containers holding Colonel Ashford's evidence and Marcus Monroe's research. Understanding that she was holding more than historical documents, she was holding proof that ordinary citizens could still challenge powerful institutions and win when they had the courage to risk everything for principles that mattered, more than personal safety. Sarah's wedding ring remained in Elias's hand, a reminder that the real treasure had always been the family bonds that made them strong enough to complete a mission that had seemed impossible just days earlier. Marcus Monroe's final gift wasn't gold or documents, it was the understanding that love and family were worth fighting for, even when the odds seemed overwhelming. 6 months after the confrontation in Colonel Ashford's vault, Elias Monroe stood at the entrance to what was now officially designated as the Ashford-Monroe Historical Preservation Site, watching his daughter direct a team of archaeologists and historians who were carefully documenting every aspect of the cave system's remarkable engineering. The trials had been swift and decisive. Dale Cruz and 17 other members of the Blackstone Mining Conspiracy were serving federal sentences for racketeering, fraud, and the systematic theft of historical artifacts across 5 states. The evidence that Emma had photographed in the flooded chamber had provided prosecutors with documentation spanning over a century of criminal activity, making it one of the largest historical fraud cases in American legal history. But more than justice, the discovery had brought something Elias hadn't expected: peace. The financial security provided by the Monroe Family Trust, established with a portion of the vault's contents, meant that Emma could attend any university she chose without the crushing debt that had destroyed so many families. More importantly, it meant they could focus on preserving and sharing the historical significance of what Marcus Monroe had died protecting. Emma emerged from the cave entrance, her face flushed with excitement and purpose. At 18, she moved with the confident stride of someone who had found her calling early and pursued it with the methodical passion she had inherited from her grandfather. Her backpack was filled with survey equipment and notebooks, documenting details that would eventually become part of a comprehensive historical record of Colonel Ashford's engineering achievement. "The university team found another chamber today," she said, settling beside her father on the wooden bench they had placed near the cave entrance. "The engineering is even more sophisticated than we realized. Ashford wasn't just hiding treasure, he was creating a permanent monument to the idea that some things are worth preserving no matter what the cost." Clara Whitfield approached through the trees, carrying a thick folder of documents and wearing the satisfied expression of a historian who had spent months connecting pieces of a puzzle that revealed something extraordinary about American history. At 72, she had found new energy in serving as the official historian for the preservation site, documenting not just Colonel Ashford's story but the broader network of resistance to corruption that he had represented. "The Smithsonian wants to create a permanent exhibition," Clara announced, settling onto the bench beside them. "Not just about the Civil War treasure, but about the pattern of citizen resistance to systematic corruption that connects Ashford's work to Marcus's research to what you accomplished in the cave." Elias smiled, thinking about how pleased his father would have been to know that his 20 years of obsessive research would eventually be recognized as legitimate historical scholarship. Marcus Monroe's journals and maps were now part of the National Archives, and graduate students from universities across the country were using his methodical documentation techniques as models for their own research. Tommy Castellanos emerged from the visitor center he had helped design and construct, carrying the easy confidence of a man who had found meaningful work after years of drifting through jobs that never seemed to matter. As the site's security director and cave safety coordinator, He had found a way to use his military skills for preservation rather than destruction. "The school groups are getting larger," Tommy reported, consulting his clipboard with the same attention to detail he had once applied to military operations. "Next week, we're hosting 300 students from Virginia and West Virginia schools. The kids are fascinated by the idea that teenagers like Emma can make historical discoveries that change how we understand the past." Emma had indeed become something of a celebrity in educational circles, speaking at schools and universities about the importance of preserving family history and the ways that patient research could uncover truths that powerful people preferred to keep hidden. But she carried her recognition with the same thoughtful seriousness that had helped her survive the confrontation in the cave. "I've been thinking about something Grandfather wrote in his final journal," Emma said, pulling out a notebook where she had transcribed some of Marcus's most important observations. "He said that the real treasure wasn't gold or artifacts, was the understanding that ordinary people could challenge powerful institutions and win if they were willing to work together and never give up." As the afternoon sun slanted through the trees surrounding the cave entrance, Elias found himself thinking about the different kinds of inheritance his father had actually left them. The financial security was important, but the real legacy was the understanding that family bonds were strong enough to survive misunderstanding and separation, and that love expressed itself sometimes through sacrifice and dedication rather than through words. The small garden they had planted near the cave entrance was flourishing vegetables and flowers that Sarah would have loved, tended by the 3 generations of Monroe women whose influence shaped everything about the preservation site. Emma had insisted on including plants that would have been familiar to Colonel Ashford's era, creating a living connection between past and present that reminded visitors that history was made by real people facing the same kinds of challenges that every generation encountered. "Your grandfather would be proud," Clara said quietly, watching Emma make notes about the archaeological discoveries that were still yielding new insights into Civil War era engineering and resistance networks. "Not just of what you found, but of what you chose to do with it." The Monroe Family Trust had funded similar preservation efforts at 12 other sites across Appalachia, protecting historical locations from corporate exploitation while creating educational opportunities for communities that had been overlooked by traditional academic institutions. Emma's college plans included studies in archaeology and public history, with the goal of expanding the Trust's work to protect historical sites throughout the American South. As they sat together in the evening light, surrounded by the mountains that had protected Colonel Ashford's secret for over a century, Elias Monroe understood that his father's final gift hadn't been treasure or vindication. It had been the opportunity to become the kind of family that Marcus had always believed they could be. Emma leaned against her father's shoulder, tired from a day of exploration but energized by the knowledge that she was carrying forward work that connected her to generations of people who had chosen truth over comfort and justice over profit. The cave entrance behind them was no longer a mystery to be solved, but a responsibility to be honored, a reminder that some inheritances were worth any risk to claim and any sacrifice to preserve. The garden they kept together grew stronger each season, rooted in soil that held the stories of people who had refused to let powerful institutions define what was possible for ordinary families willing to fight for what they believed in.